Uh-oh, the British are not in a buying mood at the beginning of the year, and the upswing in retail sales is slowing. And the prospects for the near future also remain subdued. But there are actually bright spots, but normality is still a long way away, and that's according to experts. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte is said to have once derogatorily referred to the British island as the nation of shopkeepers, so the land of retailers, and the attribution is controversial. What is certain, however, is that Great Britain's retailers have had little reason to be happy recently. The mood on the shopping streets was gloomy in January. That was said by Linda Ellett, retail and consumer goods analyst at KPMG. Larger purchases such as furniture, household goods, and electrical appliances remain scarce as the high cost of living continues for a third year. And that was also emphasized by Helen Dickinson, the chief executive of industry body the British Retail Consortium, or BRC. Even the numerous special offers at the beginning of the year did little to fuel the buying mood. At the beginning of the year, retail sales increased by 1.2% according to BRC data, and this means they lagged behind both December's 1.7% and the 3-month average of 1.9%. The gap to the current price increase was even clearer. Consumer prices rose 4% in December. The slight increase in sales is likely to mask another decline in the number of products sold. That's a trend that has now been going on for 3 years. The prospects for the current year also remain subdued. After a slight technical recession in the second half of 2023, experts at the National Institute for Economic and Social Research expect a growth rate of 0.9% in 2024 and 1.2% next year. And there is a significant risk of a worse situation, though, as the NISA analysts warn. And this fits with the long-term trend of steadily declining growth rates that was set by Ben Caswell, an economist at the think tank. The trend rate of annual growth was 3.4% between 1947 and 73 and 2.3% in the 3 following decades. And between the financial crisis and the outbreak of the pandemic, the value already shrank to 1.2% and is now even lower. But as I said, after all, there are also bright spots. The good news is that inflation is finally falling and moving back towards the Bank of England's 2% target, and that was said by Stephen Millett, the director of macro modeling at NISA. Since wages have recently grown more significantly than price increases and the central bank is given the first indications of possible interest rate cuts, households on the island are likely to feel a little boost and a slight economic improvement compared to the previous year. But given low economic growth and high costs for energy, food, and housing, living standards are recovering only slowly and will only return to pre-pandemic levels in another 3 years. That was a warning of Adrian Pabst, responsible for political issues. As in previous years, the upswing is likely to show considerable differences by region and income group. In view of the significant decline in price increases, the discussion about possible interest rate steps has also intensified in Great Britain. The interest rate is currently 5.25% but remained unchanged after a meeting of the central bank's Monetary Policy Committee last week. And Hugh Pill, the chief economist at the Bank of England, said on Monday that the question of the right time to make cuts is now the focus, rather than whether the move is even an option. And Swati Dhingra, professor of economics at the London School of Economics and external member of the Monetary Policy Committee, warned in an interview with the Financial Times on Tuesday that the central bank could be underestimating the risks to the British economy. She was the only one to recommend a rate cut at last week's meeting. Given the subdued demand behavior of households, she sees no danger of inflation flaring up again. Despite the meager growth prospects, fiscal leeway is likely to dominate the discussion in the coming weeks, though. There are elections on the island in the next 12 months, and the Conservative Party, which has been in power since 2010, has been trailing the opposition Labour Party by up to 20% in surveys for months. And there is now a lot of talk about possible tax cuts, for example, on income or inheritances. We would recommend not wasting fiscal space on pre-election giveaways, Caswell said. Instead, the money should be used for investments that increase long-term productivity and improve growth opportunities. Infrastructure is part of this, including improving transport connections in large parts of the country. In the education sector, particular focus should be placed on natural sciences and technical qualifications. In addition, housing construction would have to be significantly promoted. Economists are not alone with these recommendations. Just last week, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, warned of tax cuts in Great Britain after the organization reduced the country's growth expectations to 0.6% for the current year. The IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas pointed to growing needs in health and elderly care, education, and environmental issues. It is very important to make medium-term budget plans that take these burdens into account and at the same time ensure that the dynamics of debt are kept stable and within limits, he said. And there is also current Brexit trouble. Health authorities at Britain's port of Dover could bring legal action against the government if it does not reconsider a plan to move checks on potentially dangerous foods away from the port, creating what they say is a biosecurity risk. Dover's Port Health Authority is worried about the number of cars, vans, and lorries carrying large quantities of meat into Britain, which could be contaminated, risking illegal foods entering the market and the spread of diseases such as African swine fever and foot and mouth. Following Britain's departure from the European Union in 2020, the country has gradually been bringing in a new border system for checks, and still is. From April, the government wants to move spot checks on products of animal origin away from Dover, which handles a third of the UK's trade in goods, to a site 20 miles inland at Sevington. But the Port Health Authority and a parliamentary committee say there is no mechanism to ensure that vehicles that are sent for checks will go to the site, and there is a risk that vehicles could be unloaded before they arrive there. The health authority stepped up its opposition to the plan last week's Friday, saying it had engaged legal counsel with a view to possibly taking action. If the government will not reconsider the decision or come to the table and explain how these can be delivered, then we are considering very clearly our next steps. That was said by Lucy Manzano, head of the Dover Port Health Authority, and she told this to Reuters. We can't see how these changes are in the best interest of British biosecurity and can be delivered in a way that it doesn't put us all as consumers at risk, she says. In Britain, government plans can be challenged by judicial review. Britain's Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Department said it was working with the Port of Dover on future support options, as they put it. We have strict border controls in place to protect our high biosecurity standards and are confident that existing and new infrastructure will have the capacity and capability to maintain these standards. That was said by a government spokesperson. We cannot comment further due to ongoing legal proceedings, the spokesperson said, adding that this was a reference to the potential judicial review. The Port Health Authority's concerns about biosecurity are shared by the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee, whose chair has written to Minister Steve Barclay about the issue. Brexit has proved damaging to already sluggish levels of international investments in Brexit as well, says experts. And a 22 study by the Centre for European Reform found that Brexit already had cost the UK £33 billion in lost investment, trade and tax revenue. And the think tank found a 13.7% hit to investment when comparing the UK to a doppelganger group of similar economies across just one financial quarter. The recent Cambridge econometrics study estimated that Britain will have 32% lower investment by the middle of the next decade than without Brexit, and that's quite a lot. Brexit has also been hitting jobs and wages, say economists. The Cambridge econometric study said Brexit Britain would have 3 million fewer jobs by 2035 than if it had stayed inside the EU. And a damning 22 report from the Resolution Foundation think tank and LSE found that an average worker's real pay was set to be £470 lower each year than if Britain had stayed in the EU. They said the process would dampen pay for the rest of the decade, making the country poorer during the 2020s. And one of the most obvious impacts of Brexit has been the extra cost and hassle for UK businesses trying to export goods to the EU. And new checks on imports from the continent, now the biosecurity stuff I talked about, which will come in further waves in April and October, will make everything worse. And post-Brexit checks and expensive paperwork have added to repeated disruption at the port of Dover, while last year some supermarkets imposed rationing on certain fruit and vegetable products to deal with the shortages. And the CER study comparing Brexit Britain with doppelganger economies found that overall trade in goods was 7% lower as a result of the nation's EU exit. It tallies broadly with the 2022 Resolution Foundation study, which pointed to an 8% slump in the UK's trade openness, well, trade as a share of economic output since Brexit. Brexiteer Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch said last week that Brexit was going well and the government was working through problems. And Ms. Badenoch pointed to the fact that figures show British exports to the EU increased in 22. However, this only marks an upturn following a post-Brexit slump in 2020 and 21. It was unclear whether British firms would successfully recover from the red tape burden over time. Brexit will be a continuing drag on the economy, and businesses may adjust to the extra cost, but on the other hand, they may be increasingly cut out of some supply chains as well. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.